Helena Norberg-Hodge is a founder and director of Local Features, an organization previously known as International Society for Ecology and Culture. Local Features is an organization dedicated to the revitalization of culture and biological diversity and the strengthening of local communities and economies worldwide. Being a proponent of local economic system and an outspoken critic of economic globalization, she has produced and co-edited the award-winning documentary film, The Economics of Happiness. And she's also an author of the international best-selling book, Ancient Features, which is about tradition and change in the Himalayan region of Ladakh. She's also the author of Local is Our Future, which was published in 2019, in which she advocates for localized alternatives to the global economy, particularly involving the creation of robust local food system and democratic structures that can effectively resist authoritarianism. And she is working on a project, Ladakh project in India. And she believes that, she strongly believes that a systemic shift from a globalized economy towards a network of decentralized, localized economies could address a number of problems simultaneously, ranging from economic inequality to the climate crisis to mental illness and epidemics as well. The book which she wrote has received a wide range of attention globally. And her book was recently published and translated in Malayalam, which got good readership in Kerala as well. Helena Norberg-Hodge, welcome to Keraleeyam Talk.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. Helena, could you please explain how was your experience, how was the response that you got when you published the book Ancient Features, which was recently published and translated in Malayalam? Could you please tell us about the response you got worldwide about this book?
I got a response from countless cultures, and particularly from people who had experienced the Western world, who had been able to live in the cities of America or Europe, and who had experience of their own unique, more land-based culture. Those Jews were passionate about the book because they themselves had realized that this dominant Western model imposed by America around the world wasn't working, that it was destructive both for people, for their well-being, their physical, their mental health, and for the environment. And so they welcomed the book as a way of strengthening cultural self-respect and to help create a movement to revitalize and strengthen people's cultures and economies.
Helena, you were educated in Sweden, Germany, Australia, and United States in different countries. Could you please tell us what was the reason to come to Ladakh and associate with people's culture, and later on you had a very your experience in Ladakh has a great influential factor in your life. Could you please explain your journey to Ladakh?
I had grown up mainly in Sweden, but I also lived in America. I had studied in numerous countries, as you said. A linguist. My main interest was actually in psychology and in art, but I learned languages easily, so I became a linguist. And I was invited when I was living in Paris, working as a linguist, to go to this unknown part of Ladakh to help make a film. And they wanted me to come along to help pick up a little bit of the language because they knew that this had been sealed off and that it was very inaccessible. So they wanted me to try to pick up a bit of the language to communicate with the people. I thought I would be there for just 6 weeks to help do that. But when I came to Ladakh, I fell in love with the people, with the amazing, peaceful, and very rich culture that was there. So I ended up giving up my work and staying, and I ended up working with the people to try to find a different way of meeting the modern world.
Yeah. Helena, you have been working for a systemic change to address the issue of globalization and its culture and social impact. And we know that there are several organizations working with the same objective, but we find that majority of them do not consider the importance of changing the economic system, which is the root cause of the crisis. How do you view this lacuna of ignoring the dominant economic steamroller, as you once termed it, which is the powering on us from all sides of transitory? In this skip of the strategically key issues and drawback of our activists, including environmentalists and progressive organizers, how do you see the difference of your work?
Well, I think the reason why for me it was so clear that we needed to look at the economic system was because in Ladakh and later on Ton as well, and in both places they were very rare examples of whole economies removed from the impact of colonialism. So there I got to experience people where there was no poverty, there was no such thing as unemployment, suicide, depression were virtually So I got to experience the remarkable vitality and health of these communities, these people, and of their economies, for the contrast of what the global economic system brought in when within a decade it created unemployment, real poverty, and above all it created this big division between local people, both in terms of rich and poor, but also different ethnic and religious groups that had lived side by side for generations without conflict. So this was a dramatic and real experience of the impact of this global, top-down, centralizing system that had been affecting the whole world from, about the 1700s on, and even starting early Christianity. But I think that most people in most parts of the world, both in the less industrial and in the more industrialized places, have not been able to have that clarity of the functioning system versus what happens with the global system. So where colonialism, which was based on slave genocide, had caused so much damage, sometimes modern economic development would look like an improvement over what was there before. But the truth of the fact that we need to be thinking about a fundamentally different, that was very hard for people to see. And all the time, in both the so-called developing parts of the world, people were told all the time the dominant narrative, the dominant history, the dominant narrative was all the time telling people progress is good for you, progress is improving your life. It's such a terrible life in the past, things were always worse. So this was keeping away from people even the opportunity of stepping back to look in a more holistic way, even in terms of their lifetime. What had actually improved was no one was being encouraged to do that, to study that, to look at it. So I think the ignorance, the threads, the sort of invisible hand of the economy is pervasive. And I still believe that people take a little bit of time to step back and really look at this honestly and look at it based on accurate information. What does accurate information mean? It means information that is normally not accessible in mainstream universities, in mainstream media. We have to dig deeper. We have to look for other writers. We have to look for other voices. And we have to look English monoculture to find some of these reports, some of the very often even Western who had, for instance, like Albert Howard, who came to India to study agriculture, thinking he was going to teach India farm, and he ended up saying, no, we have much more to learn from India than England can teach India. We had many who went to America and wrote reports about finding remarkable Indian tribes that were very democratic, peaceful, with beautiful, healthy people. And the same people would later on be violent, brutal savages as the Europeans tried to steal their lands from them. And they started. So once we start looking underneath, we find lots of reports that are very convincing.
So, from your ground experience, you could realize that the grand narrative about economic globalization is unreal, and also you could find how it is damaging the life globally, right? So, from this, you could find the conclusion that local economic system should be revived. So, could you please tell us what's the importance of building local economy, and also how is it going to promote cultural and diversity across the global?
So first of all, are economies where in different parts of the world, communities, maybe whole regions, cities, even whole countries, start looking at how they can come back to a more diversified economy, where the focus is on, first of all, producing the things that need in their area, in their local area, however small, however big. It's about moving away from dependence on global businesses, on global traders that, going back to the 1700s, have been able off the land to produce cotton for England instead of producing a range of food for themselves. Is a whole range of ways of working with nature in their area, with their laws, to get the food, the clothing, the shelter, all their basic needs met from the region, and then trading where there might be something needed or attractive, might be salt, it might be some herbs that came from further away. So it always made sense to have some trade, but not to be dependent on a few global traders for everything you need, not to specialize in a monoculture production unit of just planting cotton or just tea, and focusing on perversion to produce monocultures for export, so that more and more the focus was on how can I produce transport well, not how can I produce something that's nutritious and healthy and needed. This perversion of local ecosystems to suit global traders, not the needs of people. And this is why we have a world where we can see some billionaires getting richer and richer, billionaires who operate in a global system, while the majority of people are actually getting poorer. People are actually working more hours to just the shelter, the basic needs. So localizing is a process where people start waking up to this opportunity of shifting away from servicing the needs of global billionaires to servicing the needs and the needs of their own people. And as they start coming together to shorten the distances that things travel, with a focus on food, which is the most important area to look at, it's where we can better understand the difference global economy and the local economy. Because when you are a farmer providing for the local market, you're better financially if you diversify, if you have a range of products. Ideally, the ideal model will be where you might have some animals, you have some trees, you have some bushes, you have grain, you have vegetable, and that mixed polyculture can produce far more per unit of land, per unit of water. What it requires is more human beings doing the jobs. So it provides more jobs. And because it's small and diverse, the jobs are very meaningful, they're enjoyable.
Yeah, it's true that we can find worldwide lots of movements emerging in favor of it to support diversity against centralization of power and economic system. And could you please tell us about, you have been telling about economy of happiness for a long time. So what's the spirit of economy of happiness, and was it a concept that emerged out of your experience in Ladakh in India?
Yes, it was. What happened was that I very quickly learned to speak the language fluently, and at first I wasn't planning to stay to with the local people, but because the filming had put me in touch with people in villages, and I had language, I had fallen in love with the people and the place. So when the filming was finished, I was going to do a PhD on the language. And I went region, it's a big region with about 100 villages spread around an area about 40,000 square kilometers. And I found the happiest, most healthy, most vital people I had ever met. And people were regularly telling me, was Zabos, which means we always have enough to eat and drink. They, I saw no signs of real. And so I also realized that I had never encountered people who seemed to have such a deep, calm self-respect, and therefore were so open and tolerant and so full of laughter, humor, and joy. So I lived with the people. I realized that this had to do with the whole way of life. I realized that one of the most important, it was that they lived in intergenerational communities, so that in a household, every mother had about caretakers for every child. That meant a 5-year-old brother up to an 80-year-old uncle, at least 10. This created a completely different atmosphere for the parents and for the children, a relaxed atmosphere, because every child needs so much attention, needs so much love, needs to be heard, to be recognized as a unique human being. So I discovered that this was one of the foundational cornerstones of happiness. And when I went back to Sweden, my home country, I realized that here you had an economy which was considered a success in the Western world. It was held up as an example, and the majority of people had been pushed away from the land which meant also away from an economy that to encourage intergenerational collaboration, where old and young were connected, working together, living. Instead, even as a great success story, the majority of people were living alone or in nuclear. So already in the 70s in Stockholm, more than half of all the dwellings were one person living, and the suicide rate, the depression, the alcoholism was very, very common and very obvious, but knowing back to look at the bigger picture. So I started talking about the economics of happiness, which was the economics of ecosystems where we actually do collaborate between the generations, where knowledge is passed on, but also very importantly, every child is surrounded by a group of people, not segregated into separate age groups in the called schooling, where the entire structure encourages competition, loneliness. So very, very important is for us to rethink schooling, rethink how are we training our become secure, happy, collaborative human beings? How are we making them feel good about themselves and who? Now, jobs are not naturally scarce. Unemployment never existed in an economy. It's created by economic policies that suit global corporations, but nobody else. I'd also like to add that even the people working in the global corporations are not happy. So the economics of happiness is very clear that there are universal human needs for being heard, respected, acknowledged, loved. We all have a universal need for that. But the system instead imposed a universal need to consume and to compete and fight to be a global star. The majority of humanity is suffering from that.
You clearly explained how the system imposed on us is against life, how it is promoting injustice, and also how it is destructive towards nature and life as well, human life as well. But at the same time, we know that there is a group of people who do not recognize this fact. They are the pioneers of economics around the world, including Amartya Sen, who work on social justice and human well-being, don't recognize the fact that the exponential economic growth cannot be realized with limited natural resources. That would end up in destruction of our planet itself. And on the other hand, why does the voice of ecological economists remain unheard by the governments? On one hand, the economists, they advocate for the development, they advocate for economic system, growth. But why don't you see the aspect that you have been just explaining to me?
Well, I think for me now, it's extremely important to study the progression of structures and ways that gave more and more global corporations. So first of all, we really need to understand that the entire modern economy started with slavery, where global traders were able to push people off the land. There was genocide, there was, absolute force. In Europe, people were forced off the land to become cheap labor in factories. And having set up, ever since that time, the changes in the world have kept giving more and more wealth and power, global banks and global corporations. Key steps along the way were the very beginning with, well, actually, the very beginning wasn't colonialism. It was slavery and genocide and enclosure, and then colonialism, which was again forced on. As countries were sort of liberated politically, they were becoming economically. So the economic colonization was particularly reinforced after the Second World War, when countries, particularly from the rich nations, sat around after the war discussing how to avoid another world war, avoid another depression. And they set up the World Bank, the IMF, and the GATT. And there were many pension people who really believed that the way to ensure lack of depression and war was to in economic activity around the world. Now, integrate, harmonize, these were very nice words. And politicians were not aware that what they were really doing was rolling out the red carpet for global businesses to have them to go into countries around the world. And of course, you know, the war between Russia and America was part of this American more freedom to go in the name of free trade and freedom. So people don't see what we're talking about is that for a very long time, there's been a lot of money and a lot of power supporting this path. And there have been a lot of well-intentioned people who actually believe that this is the only, who were convinced that the only choice is communism, which was seen as very oppressive and had, you know, very central government with huge military force and pressure, or the supposed freedom of American-style capitalism. We were not looking at the economics of driving people away from the land, local knowledge about local biodiversity, local climates, and with the idea that they can actually provide of their own needs if they are free to do so, and if they're free to rebuild the institutions that before the modern economy. So whether in Europe or in India or anywhere in the world, people evolved structures to work to gather the natural resources that were needed. What's happened as part of the madness of the modern economy is don't even think of natural resources as being part of the economy. They are ecologically illiterate, so blinded by the idea that technology creates wealth. They don't understand that what you do to the soil and how you create the wood and the materials that you need, that is the real economy. The earth is the real economy. They're so from that. They believe that technology creates jobs. There is enormous potential for human scale, adapted ways of doing things. But as you said before, why are we doing this? The biggest reason, the main reason, is that big money has been funding of science and technology, the direction of academia, the direction of the media. So every avenue where we can get some idea of what's happening in the world, why are things going wrong, every avenue of knowledge has been colonized. Let's agree we cannot continue rushing towards algorithms running the world that support capital accumulation for fewer and fewer people to a ridiculous, obscene level. Anybody who hears what I'm saying, please listen to this. what is happening that allows us to earn so many billions of dollars in a year. How has this been allowed? How has this happened? Why is that's what we're talking about? We're talking about understanding the mechanisms and the policies, and that means we need to look holistically what happened to knowledge, what happened to science and technology, and money is the technology, and the relation in knowledge and technology, that is what can help us understand where we are today. And pushing the pause button doesn't mean necessarily saying, no, we're not going to have any of this, saying the whole world right now is being pressured to move towards algorithms, robots, more and more. There's huge propaganda, arguing that robots will be kinder, nicer, more democratic than human beings. And that propaganda includes the idea of currencies, the internet are going to be more accountable, more visible in terms of helping us in the direction of genuinely ethical, just, and ecological ways of doing things. So the big picture, and big picture activism is what we need.
Yes, what you said is exactly correct. There is a greater belief and optimism that technology can solve the crisis that we face today, and also the greater part of the world believed that the growth-based economic system, there is no alternative for that. At the same time, the UN IPCC report reveals that our planet itself is in great danger, and climate crisis and global warming is bringing devastating effect on our own life as well as on other life on Earth. At the same, and we know that lots of governments take some steps to preserve biodiversity and also to reduce carbon emission. At the same time, no government look at the present economic system critically, and they do not think about degrowth. They do not think about economy of happiness that you have been talking about, and they all feel that they can solve the issue in the present system itself through different means. So, do you think any possibility for a shift towards degrowth, a shift towards well-being economy that you have been advocating?
I do. I think that calling it degrowth is not to get people interested. I see so many people everywhere in the world now, literally every country. The majority of people harder just to pay for their food, their clothing, their shelter. So when you say degrowth to them, you have to explain that growth has actually made them poorer. And so I think there's a better way to talk about, and I believe that talking about strengthening the local economy everywhere and looking at human scale, more localized economy is more likely to create a strong movement for change. And this is why we feel very happy that, because we long term, more adapted structures, economies need to be adapted to diverse cultures and languages. That's what's needed in the long term. So starting the process of building small scale models right now, very strategic way to go. And at the same time, we're trying to encourage a fundamental rethinking, building up a movement, a global movement that has a global perspective, an understanding of the global economy. Movement is what could, and well, what is growing already. It's a movement that's growing. And the degrowth movement, the commons movement, the donut economics. There are many different forms now, the dominant economic direction. And all of these new economy movements hopefully will come around to parity about an economics that understands, first of all, the deep eco-literacy of ecological to economic literacy. I believe that every day now, as we see more climate crises, as we how the war in Ukraine, how COVID has affected global supply chains, the knowledge about become more self-reliant, to build more localized economies is growing very rapidly. And I think I would argue is inevitable.
Yeah, it's true that there are several communities, there are several movements, organizations working towards more sustainable world. They are working for more just world. At the same time, you know that the system is so powerful that they may not be able to influence them, right? So, do you think that even individuals, there are several individuals who personally live and also advocate for such a sustainable and just life? So, do you think that these small communities and individuals can make substantial changes, or do you think that it's very important that the government should start taking radical steps for a sustainable world?
Yeah, I think that first of all, I think there are many who want to have a more human, a more ecological future. So we can see that there's been a turning, particularly in the industrialized countries, where people in the Victorian age were racist values, misogynist, anti-nature. The leadership was pushing towards this very worldview. But we can see a real progress where most people now have deeper respect for indigenous people, for non-Western culture, also for a more feminine, a more holistic view of things. So when you look at this reality of people waking up, it's actually very, however, because people often do not look at this globally, they often watch television and news and they feel very alone. So they feel it's hopeless. I'm the only one thinking like this. No, there are huge, and so the most important thing we can do is to help get the message out, all large numbers of people, that there is another way forward, and that there are countless examples of people doing things different. We can now also point to policy change at the local level. Local meaning now in small but even bigger cities. The city government is changing. In some areas, even the regional government. And collection of that information so that people see the examples growing and they get tools and ideas for what they do in their area. This is, I think, the most important work. So helping the rethinking, the big picture, putting it out in the form of films, in the form of articles, in the form of face-to-face discussions. East deciding to get together with people in your neighborhood or people in your workplace to discuss these issues from the big picture point of view is one of the most important things that we can all do to build up a stronger concept and essentially an alternative media. We need to use the internet, but we should be careful to be too dependent on it. We should also keep alive the local journals, the local radio, and just people meeting in their local areas. discussing things among themselves. Yes, governments absolutely need to change. They will not change as long as the pressure on them comes from giant corporations and trillions of dollars pushing in the opposite direction towards a fearful, resource, energy intensive, competitive path. As long as that's the only pressure they have, and we don't pressure from the people, then this blind, rhythmic global capital will win. It's like a machine.
You have been talking about how life is being destroyed by the economic system, present economic system, right? And we know that the profit-based business and interest-based banking system are the two tools of operation of the global finance and trade. And there is a common belief that there is no alternative for that. At the same time, we know that without changing the system, we cannot have a peaceful or just life on earth. So do you think an alternative possible for the existing banking system and existing model of business?
Well, again, you see what happens when you look at for profit within more localized systems. In other words, fundamental is scale. When you have and the most instructive is to look at a local farm which is producing for a local market and not too far from the farm. It could be the farm producing for the city nearby. It could be a farm in a more rural producing for people in the region. When they do, they will do better financially by diversifying range of things. Small farmers around the world have been pressured now for generations to produce larger monocultures for export. And in doing so, they've been destroying the land. They've been destroying the diversity. They've been in monocultures. And they've been encouraged to grow monocultures of things that are best suited for transport, are best suited to look on the supermarket shelf. They have not been encouraged to grow things that thrive in diverse ecosystems. The same thing is true if you have a business that perhaps deals in building materials, or if you have an engineering firm working with small-scale hydroelectric systems for use in their local area, adapted to the specifics. That would mean that the way of damming something or doing a diversion in water would be different in every place, because the rivers will be replaced. Now, so this adaptability of technology and human work to the ecological conditions is absolute for revitalizing ecosystems and human societies. Now, I think we should be very careful in the word that we've got to have only co-ops. We can't have for profit. Actually, things for profit can function if they're within a framework where the society, where the people see what the business is using, what are the benefits, what are the costs. It cannot do the right thing when it's being driven by this algorithmication to only pay attention to the bottom line without any social or environmental rules to keep things in the right direction.
Could you please just briefly tell us about the Ladakh project which is going on in India? And also, you know that the Kashmir status has been changed to a union territory. Before it was enjoying a special status in India. So do you think it's affecting your work, or how is the project in India is going on?
Well, the project in Ladakh has suffered a lot, massive increase in tourism. So we've had a lot of Indian tourists coming in, and the pressure of all that, to shift all economic activity to suit tourism has been a huge problem. The destruction of local production, agriculture for local needs, has continued. But now in Ladakh, like almost everywhere on the planet, even young people need to question this. They're beginning to become interested in agriculture, even though until very recently farming was stupid and backward and useless, and only someone who's uneducated and worthless would think of farming. There's now a renewed, and this is what we're still working with in Ladakh, those young people. There's also now a shift towards organic agriculture. We are hopeful that, again, the movement there will be strengthened by being more connected globally. A very important paradox with the localization that we're promoting is localization based on international exchange and collaboration, not isolation. It's not about withdrawing. It is about withdrawing from dependence on the dominant narrative, from the mainstream narrative, and trying to get a bit of independence from the financial to create alternatives. Connecting with those alternatives around the world is a very important part of the work, our work in Ladakh.
Helena, it was a very much constructive and insightful discussion we had. Keraleeyam is very much thankful to you for spending so much time in spite of having a hectic work schedule for you. Thank you very much, Helena.
Thank you. So grateful for the work you're doing, and I would love to stay in touch and hope that we can collaborate in the future.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you.